Britain supports democratic self-rule in emerging countries. Yet British self-determination is ridiculed and denigrated as being parochial and xenophobic. The advantages of EU membership far outweigh any national interest, we are told. But do they?
Before the UK joined the Common Market in 1973, cost-benefit analyses predicted negative economic consequences. During the last 10 years, not one respected analysis has concluded that the UK derives any net economic benefit from EU membership. Evidence is accumulating that the ongoing annual cost of Britain's EU membership could be 140 billion or more. Despite repeated requests, all three major British political parties have refused to carry out a cost-benefit analysis of Britain's EU membership, almost certainly because they know what the result will be. Membership of the single market is said to be vital for British trade. The facts, however, appear to suggest otherwise. A country does not have to belong to the single market to export to the single market. The USA and China, not EU members, with no votes in the EU Council of Ministers, no MEPs, no commissioners, no judges in the European Court of Justice, and no army of Brussels-based civil servants, each sell more to the EU than the UK does, without paying a cent to Brussels or imposing one iota of EU regulation on their domestic economies. Closer to home, Norway and Switzerland, not EU members, export far more to the EU in relation to their GDPs or population than the UK. In fact, the whole of the rest of the world can trade with the EU without membership. The case for membership of the single market based on imports and exports continues to be tenuous. Since the turn of the century, British exports to the world outside the EU have grown 37% faster than exports to the EU. A major factor affecting the ailing EU markets is the excessive single market regulation. Today, 60% of UK exports go outside the EU and 40% to the EU. The argument that the single market makes it easier to import goods and services just doesn't add up. From 1999 to 2009, British imports from outside the EU increased 18% faster than imports from the EU. It would appear, therefore, that UK imports and exports do not benefit greatly from UK membership of the single market. In fact, it's the opposite. The following are just 4 further damaging effects of membership. Exports to the EU account for less than 10% of British economic output. The remaining 90% of British economic activity consists of trade within Britain or with the rest of the world. Yet that 90% still has to comply with the whole body of hugely expensive single market regulation, with often damaging effect. The UK has a massive structural trade deficit with EU countries. They sell more to us than we sell to them. In the 5 years, 2006 to 2010, for example, our accumulated trade deficit with the EU was 143 billion, whilst UK trade with the rest of the world was more or less in balance. A consequence of this massive deficit has been the transfer of roughly 2 million British jobs to Germany, France and other EU countries, many of them highly skilled that might otherwise have remained in the UK. It's worth pointing out as well that after British withdrawal, the EU would continue to trade with the UK and vice versa, as the UK is the EU's biggest customer worldwide. There are a number of options open to the UK other than EU membership. Here are just 3. A radical option for the UK would be to withdraw from the EU completely and under the World Trade Organization umbrella to unilaterally declare genuine free trade with the countries of the world, including the remaining EU. Following such withdrawal, the UK ought to consider making the Commonwealth the main focus and vector of its global trade policy. In 2050, for example, viewed from the UK, the Commonwealth will constitute a market 9 times greater than that of continental EU. By a fortunate accident of history, the Commonwealth will be where much of global GDP and trade growth will occur over the next half-century. Switzerland, surrounded on all sides by the EU, has, with the approval of the Swiss electorate through referenda, set up a series of industry-by-industry free trade agreements with the EU. Switzerland retains full sovereign control over areas covered in the Swiss-EU free trade areas, each side retaining its veto. With one exception, in civil aviation, none of the bilateral free trade agreements obliges Switzerland to adopt the relevant part of the acquis communautaire, the massive EU Book of Rules. This is a model Britain could easily copy. Switzerland, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein are members of the 50-year-old European Free Trade Association, EFTA, of which Britain was a founder member before joining the EU. Unlike the EU, EFTA is not a customs union in which members surrender control to the centre. Each EFTA member conducts its own trade policies and sits and votes at the World Trade Organization in its own right. 3 of the 4 EFTA states, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, are members with the EU 27 of the 30-member European Economic Area, but remain outside the Common Agriculture Policy, the Common Fisheries Policy, EU Foreign and Defence Policies, EU Justice and Home Affairs Policies, EU Monetary Union, and any other policy not specifically provided for in the EEA Treaty.
23rd of June 2014. Dear Herman, Jose Manuel, Angela, Nicholas. UK resumption of sovereignty. On 19th of June 2014, in a referendum, the British electorate voted decisively to leave the European Union. The purpose of this letter is to let you know how the implementation of the electorate's decision by Her Majesty's government will affect the principal strands of the relationship between the EU and the UK. This letter also constitutes the UK's official notification of its decision to withdraw from the EU under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union, as amended by the Lisbon Treaty. The UK will become an independent sovereign state and cease to be a member of the EU, its institutions and agencies exactly 2 years from now, on 23rd of June 2016, referred to hereinafter as I-Day. The UK will cease to be subject to EU law, regulation and case law on I-Day. Yours sincerely, signed, the Prime Minister. Countersigned, the Leader of Her Majesty's Opposition. London, 23rd of June, 2014.
For the purposes of this film, we have chosen to date our letter of withdrawal on the 23rd of June 2014. The UK will become an independent sovereign state and cease to be a member of the EU exactly 2 years from now, on the 23rd of June 2016, referred to hereinafter as I-Day. The UK will cease to be subject to EU regulation and case law on I-Day. As from tomorrow, only British courts, including the House of Lords and the UK Supreme Court, will interpret and apply EU law without reference to the European Court of Justice. From tomorrow, judgments of the European Court of Justice will not be applied in the UK. A new British ministry, the Ministry of EU Transitional Arrangements, MITA, headed by a senior cabinet minister, will be charged as from tomorrow, 24th of June 2014, with the responsibility for managing and negotiating all aspects of the transition process. His or her second in command will be a senior opposition shadow minister. Other ministries will report to MITA on all transition matters. MITA will be staffed by experienced specialists from the British private sector, from business, transport, energy, the city, farming, fishing, military and legal circles. MITA will complete the bulk of its work by I-Day, but remain in existence for a further 2 years to help resolve any leftover issues. By statute, MITA will be dissolved exactly 4 years from today. British MEPs will continue to represent their constituencies in the European Parliament until I-Day, but will not participate or vote in any new legislation during that 24-month period. Their salaries and allowances will be progressively reduced to reflect their reduced workload. They will resign their seats on I-Day. British officials and employees of the Council, Commission and all other EU institutions and agencies will negotiate the timing and terms of their departure with the relevant EU authorities. The UK's monthly gross contributions to and receipts from the EU budget will be reduced by 1/24 on a straight-line basis in each of the 24 months between now and I-Day to reflect the progressive disengagement of the UK from the EU over that period. On I-Day, the UK will withdraw from the EU Customs Union and UK trade will cease to be regulated by the EU. At the World Trade Organization, the UK will resume its own seat and vote in its own right. Trade between the UK and the EU, and between the UK and the rest of the world, will be conducted as already provided for in other multilateral treaties, as well as relevant declarations of the Commonwealth. On I-Day, the UK will cease to participate in EU defence planning, activities and operations, including arms procurement agencies. From I-Day onwards, the deployment of British armed forces in defence of the European continent will be conducted through NATO. On I-Day, the UK will withdraw from all direct EU foreign policy involvement. The UK will cease all involvement in economic and monetary union, including the European Central Bank, on I-Day. The UK will cease all involvement in the Common Agricultural Policy and the Common Fisheries Policy on I-Day. The UK will cease all involvement in EU immigration and asylum matters and resume full and absolute control of its borders on I-Day. On I-Day, the UK will cease all involvement in EU aid programmes worldwide. From I-Day onwards, UK government aid will be provided direct to recipient countries or through multilateral agencies such as the UN. In addition to the policy areas specified above, the UK, on I-Day, will cease involvement in all other EU policy areas, including banking, supervision, health and safety, policing, education, regulation of working time, climate change, human rights, etc., etc. A bill to give effect to the measures set out above will be laid before the House of Commons next week. And then we will be free. It's as simple as that. Customs unions are redundant. They have lost their raison d'etre. The EU is a fast-failing experiment which no other continent has emulated. The preferred option for the majority of the countries of the world, 165 out of 192, is the self-governing nation-state. UK withdrawal would result in the British people rejoining that 95% of the world's population that live in those self-governing states and successfully trade with each other and with the EU multilaterally. It's time for Britain to say no to membership of the EU.